Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The wind howled through the rugged valleys of the Dragon Mountains, whipping Ethan's cloak as he and his small company pressed forward. The peaks loomed like sentinels in the distance, cloaked in mist and mystery, a silent reminder of the ancient power that resided within. For as long as anyone could remember, the Dragon clan had ruled these lands, and for as long as Ethan could remember, they had been the subject of both reverence and fear among his people. But now, the fragile peace between the kingdom of Aldoria and the dragons was hanging by a thread. The treaty, signed a century ago, was expiring in mere days, and there were whispers in both human and dragon lands of a war unlike any the world had ever seen. The very thought chilled Ethan to his core. He had seen enough death and destruction in his years of knighthood to last a lifetime. If war broke out between humans and dragons, it would not only tear his homeland apart but likely decimate both species. It was why Ethan had volunteered for this mission, despite the risk to his life. He was not the strongest knight, nor the most seasoned in battle. But he had something others seemed to lack, a belief that diplomacy and understanding could triumph over bloodshed. He had spent countless hours studying the ancient texts, learning about the history of the Dragon clan, the sacred oaths, and the forgotten alliances between their kind and humanity. His king had been reluctant to send him. The council had argued that dragons could not be reasoned with, that they were too proud, too dangerous, too different. But Ethan had pleaded, and eventually, the king had relented, giving him a final warning before he left. "The fate of our kingdom rests in your hands," the king had said, his eyes heavy with the weight of what was to come. "If you fail, there will be no stopping the bloodshed." Those words echoed in Ethan's mind now as he and his companions crossed the final ridge that led to the Dragon Citadel. The ancient fortress, carved into the very heart of the mountains, was a masterpiece of dragon craftsmanship, massive stone walls that seemed to grow from the earth itself, towers that spiraled into the sky, their tops lost in the clouds. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a place where human footsteps had not been heard for generations. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" Sir Aldrich asked, his voice low. The older knight had been a mentor to Ethan since he was a boy, training him in the ways of the sword, the shield, and the heart. Aldrich was no stranger to war and had the scars to prove it, but there was something about this mission that unsettled even him. "We don't have a choice," Ethan replied, though he could feel the tension in his own voice. "If we don't make them see reason, if we don't at least try," Aldrich sighed, nodding. "I know. Just be careful. Dragons aren't like us. Their ways are older than the mountains, and their pride is their greatest weapon." Ethan nodded, but there was no turning back now. He knew the risks. He knew that once they entered the Dragon Citadel, they would be at the mercy of the Dragon clan. But he also knew that this was the only way to prevent the war from spilling across the land like wildfire. They reached the entrance to the citadel, a massive archway flanked by two stone dragon statues, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. For a moment, Ethan wondered if the statues were real, if the dragons were simply lying in wait, watching their every move. He pushed the thought aside and stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, not in aggression, but as a reminder of his duty. Inside, the citadel was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of ancient stone and the faintest hint of sulfur. They were met by a group of dragon guards, their scales shimmering in the low light. These were no ordinary dragons, they were the elite of their kind, their eyes sharp and unblinking as they sized up the intruders. "The High Elder awaits," one of the guards said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very walls. "Follow." Ethan exchanged a glance with Aldrich and the others, then followed the guard deeper into the citadel. The halls were vast, lit by the faint glow of magical runes etched into the walls, casting eerie shadows as they passed. Every step felt like a journey into the unknown, a reminder that they were far from home and far from safety. Finally, they reached the heart of the citadel, a grand hall with a ceiling so high it seemed to touch the sky. In the center of the room, on a throne carved from obsidian, sat Xyrex, the High Elder of the Dragon clan. He was massive, even by dragon standards, his scales a deep, shimmering black that seemed to absorb the light around him. His eyes, ancient and calculating, regarded Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You are the human who seeks to negotiate," Xyrex said, his voice a low growl that reverberated through the hall. "Speak." Ethan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but standing before the High Elder, all his carefully prepared words seemed to vanish. He took a deep breath, reminding himself why he was here. "I am Ethan of Aldoria," he began, his voice steady. "I come not as an enemy, but as a messenger of peace." Xyrex's eyes narrowed. "Peace? Is that what your kind calls it when they break their oaths and prepare for war?" "We have not broken our oaths," Ethan said quickly. "But the treaty is about to expire, and without a new agreement, both our peoples will suffer. War will destroy us all." The dragon's lips curled into a snarl. "Do not presume to lecture me on the consequences of war, human. I have lived through more battles than you can imagine. Your kind is weak, treacherous. Why should we believe your words now?" Ethan knew this would not be easy. The dragons had their own grievances, their own reasons for mistrusting humanity. But he also knew that if he could not win Xyrex's trust, there would be no hope for peace. "I am not here to make excuses for the past," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I am here to forge a new future. One where humans and dragons can coexist without fear, without bloodshed." Xyrex rose from his throne, towering over Ethan and his companions. "You speak of coexistence, yet your people have done nothing but take from us. You have encroached on our lands, stolen our resources, hunted our kind. Why should we believe that you will honor any new agreement?" "Because I am willing to offer more than words," Ethan replied. He could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the dragons upon him, the tension thick enough to cut with a blade. "I am willing to prove my sincerity, to show you that we are not your enemies." Xyrex's gaze bore into him. "Prove it? And how do you intend to do that, human?" Ethan swallowed hard. This was the moment. The trial. The test of his courage, his integrity. He had known this would come, and yet, standing here now, it felt more daunting than he had ever imagined. "I will enter the cavern of truth," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "And face whatever challenges lie within. If I am found lacking, you have my life." A murmur rippled through the dragons in the hall. Even Aldrich stiffened beside him, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. But Ethan didn't waver. He knew that this was the only way. Xyrex's eyes gleamed with something that almost resembled approval. "Very well, human. If you wish to prove your worth, then so be it. The cavern of truth will reveal the strength of your heart. But know this, many have entered, and few have returned." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "I understand." With a gesture from Xyrex, 2 dragon guards stepped forward, leading Ethan toward the cavern's entrance. Aldrich reached out, his voice low. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. We can find another way." But Ethan shook his head. "There is no other way. This is the only way to win their trust." Aldrich didn't argue further, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He knew, just as Ethan did, that this was no simple test. The Cavern of Truth was a place of legend, a sacred space where the deepest fears and darkest secrets were laid bare. It was said to be a place where the soul itself was tested. As the doors to the cavern opened before him, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The air inside was cold, the darkness oppressive. But he stepped forward without hesitation, leaving behind the safety of his companions and the hall. The doors closed behind him with a deep, echoing thud, leaving him alone in the silence. Inside the cavern, there was no light, save for the faint glow of the runes that marked the walls. Each step he took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, and as he moved deeper, he began to feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. And then, without warning, the visions began. He saw himself standing on a battlefield, surrounded by the dead and dying. His armor was stained with blood, his sword heavy in his hand. The bodies of humans and dragons alike littered the ground, and the sky above was dark with smoke. This was the future he had feared, the future he had come to prevent. And yet, here it was, laid out before him like a cruel joke. "You cannot stop this," a voice whispered in his ear, cold and mocking. "This is your fate. This is the fate of your people." Ethan shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he whispered. "This isn't real. This doesn't have to happen." But the vision didn't fade. Instead, it grew more vivid, more terrible. He saw Aldrich fall, cut down by a dragon's talons. He saw the king's castle reduced to rubble, his people fleeing in terror as the dragons rained fire upon them. And in the midst of it all, he saw himself, helpless, broken, unable to save them. "You are too weak," the voice said again, louder this time. "You will fail." Ethan dropped to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the vision, of the fear and doubt that had always lingered in the back of his mind, pressed down on him like a physical force. But then, in the darkest moment, he remembered why he had come. He remembered the stories of the ancient alliance, of the oath that had once bound humans and dragons together in peace. He remembered the words of his mentor, of the king, of the hope that had driven him to this place. And then he heard another voice, a deeper, calmer voice that seemed to come from the very heart of the cavern. "You are stronger than your fears, Ethan of Aldoria." He looked up, and before him stood the spirit of Aurelius, an ancient dragon whose presence filled the cavern with light. Aurelius's eyes gleamed with wisdom and power, and in that moment, Ethan understood the fear, the doubt. It was all a test. A test to see if he could rise above it, if he could hold on to his belief in peace, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. "You came here seeking peace," Aurelius said, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. "And peace is not found in the absence of fear, but in the courage to face it." Ethan nodded, rising to his feet. "I understand." Aurelius smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Then go. Fulfill your destiny." The light faded, and with it, the visions disappeared. Ethan found himself standing once more in the darkness of the cavern, but this time, he felt no fear. He had passed the test. He had faced the truth. When he emerged from the cavern, the dragons were waiting. Zyrex stood at the front of the hall, his eyes fixed on Ethan. For a moment, there was only silence, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Zyrex bowed his head. "You have proven yourself, human. The oath shall be renewed." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The oath had been renewed, but now it was up to him to ensure that the peace would last. And so, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, Ethan swore the oath of the dragon, binding himself to the fate of both humans and dragons. The war had been averted, but the future was uncertain. Ethan knew that peace was fragile, and that it would take more than words to keep it. Ethan stood at the entrance of the dragon citadel, the weight of the new oath heavy on his shoulders. The vast hall behind him, where moments ago the oath of the dragon had been sworn, now seemed quieter, almost serene. But beneath that calm exterior, he knew the true work was only beginning. As he and his companions began the long descent from the mountain, the wind howled, whispering ancient secrets between the peaks. The journey back would be just as perilous as the one that had brought them here, but there was a difference now. Ethan carried the hope of peace, something fragile yet precious, between two powerful forces that could easily turn to war. Aldrich walked beside him in silence, his weathered face set in a frown. The old knight had seen countless battles, but this was something beyond the sword and shield, an uneasy alliance brokered on faith, and it was clear Aldrich didn't trust the fragile peace that had been forged. "You did what you had to," Aldrich said after a long stretch of silence, his voice rough against the wind. "But it's not over, is it?" Ethan shook his head. "No. The oath is just the beginning. We've delayed war, but maintaining peace will be the real challenge." The path down from the mountain was treacherous, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. Zyrex had made it clear that while the dragons would honor the oath, they were watching closely. The slightest sign of betrayal from the human kingdom would bring them back to the brink of war. And with dragons, there would be no second chances. Aldrich's voice interrupted his thoughts. "What happens if your king doesn't honor the terms?" Ethan had already asked himself that question a dozen times. The king's court was full of advisors who believed that dragons could never be trusted, that force would eventually be necessary to secure their kingdom's future. They would argue that Ethan's deal was nothing more than a temporary measure, a way to buy time until the human armies were ready. Ethan knew that convincing them otherwise would be his next battle. "I'll make him understand," Ethan said, though his voice lacked the confidence he wished it had. "I have to." Aldrich gave him a sideways glance, eyes sharp beneath his brow. "You've risked your life for this, boy. You've made promises that might not be yours to keep. If the king turns his back on this peace, what will you do then?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Ethan didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The truth was, he didn't know what he would do. He could only hope that the king would see the value in what had been achieved, that the peace would hold. But hope was as fragile as the treaty itself. The descent continued in silence until they reached the lower slopes of the mountain range, where the air grew warmer and the land began to flatten out. The sight of the fertile valley below filled Ethan with a mixture of relief and dread. Home. Aldoria. The kingdom he had sworn to protect. The people he had fought so hard to save from the horrors of a war they could not win. And now, the burden of ensuring that peace rested on his shoulders alone. When they finally arrived at the gates of the capital, the sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the stone walls. The city was bustling as it always was, but there was an underlying tension in the air. People whispered of dragons, of war, of the treaty that was expiring. Word of Ethan's mission had spread, and as they rode through the streets, he could feel the eyes of the people upon him. Some looked hopeful, others suspicious. At the royal court, the tension was even thicker. The king's advisors had gathered in the grand hall, their faces grim and expectant. Ethan and Aldrich dismounted and were quickly escorted inside, where the king awaited them on his throne, flanked by lords and nobles who eyed Ethan with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. King Valen sat forward, his crown glinting in the torchlight. "You have returned," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the unknown. "Tell me, Sir Ethan. What have you accomplished? Ethan took a deep breath, stepping forward. The dragons have agreed to a new oath. War has been averted, for now. A murmur rippled through the court. Some of the nobles leaned in, eager to hear more. Others folded their arms, clearly unimpressed. And what does this new oath demand of us? One of the king's advisers, Lord Kendrick, asked. He was an older man, his face lined with years of counsel, and he had always been vocal in his belief that the dragons could not be trusted. Surely the dragons did not agree to peace without their own demands. Ethan held his ground, knowing this would be the most difficult part. The dragons wish to be treated as equals, not enemies. They have demanded that we respect the boundaries of their lands, and they expect us to honor the spirit of the treaty, not just the words. In return, they will do the same. A low scoff came from the other side of the room. And what makes you think they will keep their word? Lord Cedric, one of the more militant voices in the court, crossed his arms, his eyes hard. Dragons are prideful creatures. They will turn on us the moment they see weakness. The same could be said of us, Ethan countered, keeping his voice calm. But they gave me their word. And they tested me in ways that would break a lesser man. They value honor above all else, and they will hold to their oath, as long as we do. King Valen studied him for a long moment. The king had always been a man of few words, and his silence now weighed heavily in the hall. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. You believe this peace is worth the risk? I do, Ethan said firmly. The alternative is war, a war we cannot win. The dragons are stronger, older, and wiser than we give them credit for. If we do not keep this peace, it will mean the end of Aldoria as we know it. The king leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Ethan could feel the eyes of the court upon him, waiting for the king's judgment. Finally, King Valen nodded. We will honor the oath. For now. A sigh of relief swept through Ethan, though he knew this was only the first step. The real challenge would be in making sure that the peace lasted, that neither side gave in to the temptations of pride or fear. But as he stood before the court, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The war had been averted. The bloodshed had been postponed. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would fight to ensure that it stayed that way. The days that followed were filled with tense negotiations. Messages were sent back and forth between the kingdom and the dragon clan, each side working to solidify the terms of the new treaty. It wasn't easy. There were moments where it seemed as though everything might fall apart. But through it all, Ethan remained steadfast, his mind focused on the larger goal. Peace. It had to be peace, and slowly, surely, the tension began to ease. The dragons withdrew from the borders, and the people of Aldoria began to breathe a little easier. But Ethan knew the peace was fragile, that it would take constant vigilance to maintain. He spent his days in council meetings, his nights poring over maps and letters, working tirelessly to keep both sides satisfied. It wasn't until weeks later, as he stood on the walls of the capital, looking out over the distant horizon, that Ethan allowed himself to finally feel the weight lift from his shoulders. The oath had been sworn. The war had been averted. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that perhaps, just perhaps, peace was possible. Aldrich joined him on the wall, his usual stoic expression softening slightly as he gazed out at the same view. You've done something remarkable, Ethan, the old knight said, his voice gruff but sincere. I didn't think it was possible, but you've given us a chance. Ethan smiled, though it was a tired smile. A chance is all I ever wanted. And now we have to make sure we don't waste it, Aldrich added, his eyes hardening once more. The dragons will be watching, and so will the rest of the kingdom. There are those who still believe this peace won't last. I know, Ethan said quietly. But we'll prove them wrong. The two men stood in silence for a long time, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the land. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt hope. True, unshakable hope, and as long as that hope remained, he would continue to fight for the peace he had sworn to protect.